Good day, brothers and sisters. We'll just be continuing our reading in this book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. Really quick, Michelle, I'm not going to read her this summary that they have on her. Just the first couple of sentences. Michelle Alexander is a highly acclaimed civil rights lawyer, an advocate, and legal scholar. And much more to say. She is a graduate of Stanford Law School and Vanderbilt University. She clerked for Justice Harry A. Blackmun on the U.S. Supreme Court and for Chief Judge Abner Mikva on the D.C. Circuit Court of the U.S. Court of Appeals. She spent most of her time fighting for social justice. It wasn't until around 2000 that she began to realize what was going on, and then 10 years later, 2010 is when this book was finished. I'm asking that you prepare yourselves mentally, emotionally, and psychologically, because this book is eye-opening, and it is groundbreaking. It is quite stirring of the soul to the hearer, the reader, and the listener. Now let us go into the introduction. I have only read a little bit ahead, as in what I'm going to be doing these just 10 to 15 minute videos. Please continue to stay tuned. I believe you will, due to how, as Cornel West said, how poignant she is in expressing and explaining what's going on in the new Jim Crow. Let's get into the introduction. Jarvius Cotton cannot vote. Like his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather, he has been denied the right to participate in our electoral democracy. Cotton's family tree tells the story of several generations of black men who were born in the United States, but who were denied the most basic freedom that democracy promises: the freedom to vote for those who will make the rules and laws that govern one's life. Cotton's great-great-grandfather could not vote as a slave. His great-grandfather was beaten to death by the Ku Klux Klan for attempting to vote. His grandfather was prevented from voting by Klan intimidation. His father was barred from voting by poll taxes and literacy tests. Today, Jarvius Cotton cannot vote because he, like many black men in the United States, has been labeled a felon and is currently on parole. Cotton's story illustrates, in many respects, the old adage, the more things change, the more they remain the same. In each generation, new tactics have been used for achieving the same goals. Goals shared by the founding fathers. I know a lot of people would like to deny it, but listen to this. Denying African Americans citizenship was deemed essential to the formation of the original Union. Hundreds of years later, America is still not an egalitarian democracy. The arguments and rationalizations that have been trotted out in support of racial exclusion and discrimination in its various forms have changed and evolved, but the outcome has remained largely the same. An extraordinary percentage of black men in the United States are legally barred from voting today, just as they have been throughout most of American history. They are also subject to legalized discrimination in employment, housing, education, public benefits, and jury service, just as their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents once were. What has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than with the language we use to justify it. In the era of color blindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't, rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. Miss Alexander goes on to say, I reached the conclusions presented in this book reluctantly. 10 years ago, now mind you, remember, this book was first published in 2010. So she's speaking of in the year 2000. She says, 10 years ago, I would have argued strenuously against the central claim made here, namely that something akin to a racial caste system currently exists in the United States. Indeed, if Barack Obama had been elected president back then, I would have argued that his election marked the nation's triumph over racial caste, the final nail in the coffin of Jim Crow. My elation would have been tempered by the distance yet to be traveled to reach the promised land of racial justice in America. But my conviction that nothing remotely similar to Jim Crow exists in this country would have been steadfast. I'm on page 2. I'm going to finish this last paragraph, and then we'll be finished with this particular video. She goes on to say, Today, my elation over Obama's election is tempered by a far more sobering awareness. As an African American woman with 3 young children who will never know a world in which a black man could not be president of the United States, I was beyond thrilled on election night. Yet when I walked out of the election night party, full of hope and enthusiasm, I was immediately reminded of the harsh realities of the new Jim Crow. A black man was on his knees in the gutter. I repeat, a black man was on his knees in the gutter, hands cuffed behind his back, as several police officers stood around him talking, joking, and ignoring his human existence. People poured out of the building. Many stared for a moment at the black man cowering in the street and then averted their gaze. What did the election of Barack Obama mean for him? To be continued.